The moment my son looked across a room full of people and said, "Everything I have, I earned by myself," something inside me quietly broke. I stood beside his dining table holding a cake I had baked with my own hands while his guests applauded his success. Then Ethan laughed and added, "No one stayed up worrying about me. I learned to survive on my own." He never saw Dr. Reynolds praying outside an ICU room. He never remembered the woman sleeping in a hospital chair for 32 nights. And he certainly forgot whose hands were shaking every time a machine beside his bed stopped beeping. My name is Sydney Bennett, and my son forgot who stayed awake during the hardest nights of his entire life. Before you hear the rest of my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe. And if you've ever loved someone who forgot your sacrifices, share your feelings in the comments. Sometimes strangers understand our pain better than family does. My name is Sydney Bennett, and for most of my life, I believed that love was measured by the things we quietly carried for other people. When Ethan was 6 months old, I learned how heavy love could become. His father, Robert Bennett, left us on a rainy Thursday afternoon in Cleveland, Ohio. I still remember the sound of his car pulling away from our small duplex while Ethan cried in his crib upstairs. Robert stood beside the front door holding his jacket. "I can't do this anymore, Sid." I thought he meant the bills, the mortgage, his job at the manufacturing plant that had recently closed. Instead, he looked toward our son's room. "He needs too much. Everything is always about hospitals and doctors." Ethan had been born nearly 2 months early. Since his birth, he had struggled with breathing problems. He spent more time in doctors' offices than playgrounds. Every cough frightened me. Every fever sent me into panic. Robert couldn't handle it. He kissed Ethan once before leaving. That was the last day my son ever saw his father. But I never told Ethan that. For years, I told him that his father loved him but couldn't stay because life had taken him somewhere else. I wanted my son to grow up believing he had been loved by both parents. Maybe that was my first mistake. I was 30 years old working as a night nurse at Mercy General Hospital. The pay wasn't terrible, but it wasn't enough for specialists' medications, oxygen equipment, and endless medical appointments. During the day, I was a mother. At night, I became a nurse. Somewhere between those hours, I tried to remain a human being. I would place Ethan in the care of my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Walters, around 6 in the evening. Then, I would drive to the hospital work 12 hours on my feet and return home shortly after sunrise. Many mornings, I never even changed clothes. I simply picked Ethan up from his crib and held him while the sun came through our kitchen window. He had soft brown hair and enormous blue eyes. When he smiled, the entire world felt manageable. But his breathing always worried me. At 8 months old, he developed his first serious infection. At 1 year old, he spent 3 nights in the hospital. At 2 years old, he was diagnosed with severe respiratory complications that required constant monitoring. Doctors began explaining terms I had never heard before: chronic airway disease, oxygen saturation, emergency protocols. I carried notebooks filled with medical instructions. I learned how to listen to his breathing while he slept. I learned that mothers rarely sleep deeply. One evening after work, I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor because I simply didn't have enough money to pay both the electric bill and Ethan's medication. The bottle sat on the table. The overdue bill sat beside it. I cried quietly because Ethan was asleep in the next room. The following morning, I sold my grandmother's necklace. It wasn't worth much, but it bought another month of medicine. I never regretted selling it. I only regretted that Ethan would someday grow up without knowing what had disappeared so he could survive. As he became older, he asked questions about his father. Did Dad like baseball? Did Dad ever hold me? Will he come back someday? Each question felt like a knife. I answered gently. Your father loved you. Your father wanted you to be happy. Life is complicated. I protected a man who had abandoned us because I wanted my son to grow up without anger. I wanted him to feel complete. Looking back now, I wonder if I protected the wrong person. When Ethan turned 5, I took him to Lake Erie for the first time. He wore a red jacket that was slightly too big. He chased birds along the shore and laughed louder than I had heard in months. For a few hours, he wasn't a sick child. He wasn't a medical chart. He wasn't a patient. He was simply my son. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat beside his bed and watched him breathe. His chest rose, then fell. Rose, then fell. Most mothers probably didn't count breaths. I did, every night, because sometimes his breathing changed without warning. Sometimes he coughed until he turned pale. Sometimes he woke up unable to catch his breath. Those nights taught me that fear can become a permanent resident inside a mother's heart. At the hospital, my coworkers often asked me why I never applied for management positions. The promotions would have doubled my salary. The hours would have been easier. But management positions required travel and longer shifts. I couldn't risk being away from Ethan. If the school called, I had to answer. If he became sick, I had to leave. So I stayed where I was, year after year. One afternoon, my supervisor sat beside me in the break room. "Sydney, you're one of the best nurses here." I smiled. "Thank you. You could do much more." I looked down at my hands. "I already am." She didn't understand. Very few people did. My entire life existed between hospital hallways and my son's bedroom. There wasn't room for ambition. There wasn't room for romance. There wasn't room for dreams. There was only Ethan. As he grew older, his health slowly improved. The emergency visits became less frequent. The medications decreased. He began playing baseball. He joined school activities. He made friends. And every achievement felt like a miracle. At night, after he fell asleep, I started writing in a small blue notebook. I wrote about every difficult day, every hospital visit, every fear, every victory. I wanted to remember. I wanted him to know someday. But I never gave him those notebooks. Instead, I placed them inside an old wooden box in my bedroom closet. Alongside them, I kept medical bills, hospital bracelets, photographs, and letters from doctors. It became a record of our survival, a history of nights nobody else had seen. One evening, when Ethan was 10 years old, he walked into the kitchen and asked me something I never forgot. "Mom." "Yes." "If I got really sick again, would you stay with me?" I laughed softly. "Of course." Even all night, I knelt beside him. "Ethan, there isn't a place on earth that could keep me away from you." He wrapped his arms around my neck. I knew it. At that moment, I believed he would always remember. I believed children never forget who sat beside their beds. I believed love left permanent marks. I was wrong, because many years later, my son would stand in a beautiful dining room filled with successful people and tell the world that nobody had ever stayed awake worrying about him. And as I listened to those words, I realized that memories can disappear. But sacrifice never does. The winter Ethan almost died began with something so ordinary that I almost ignored it. He was 4 years old. It was early January, and Cleveland had disappeared beneath snow and ice. The old furnace inside our small house struggled to keep the rooms warm, and every window carried a thin layer of frost. That morning, Ethan complained that he was tired. Normally, he ran through the house pretending to be a baseball player or a firefighter. But that day, he sat quietly on the living room carpet, holding his stuffed bear. "Mom, I'm cold." I touched his forehead. He was burning. His temperature was already over 103 degrees. I called his pediatrician, who told me to monitor him carefully and bring him in if his breathing worsened. Ethan had experienced fevers before, but something about his eyes frightened me. He looked exhausted. Too exhausted. I called the hospital and told them I couldn't work that night. My supervisor understood. Everyone at Mercy General knew Ethan's medical history. By evening, the snowstorm had become severe. The weather station warned people to stay off the roads. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Ethan lay on the couch under 2 blankets. I sat beside him, counting every breath. 32 breaths per minute, 36. 40, too fast. His small chest rose and fell rapidly. Around midnight, he suddenly began coughing. Not ordinary coughing. It sounded like he couldn't pull air into his lungs. He sat upright, terrified. "Mom!" I grabbed him immediately. His lips had started turning pale. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps. I knew enough medicine to recognize danger. But I was also his mother. And mothers panic. I called emergency services, but because of the storm, they warned me that ambulances were severely delayed. I looked outside. Snow covered the streets. Wind pushed against the windows. No headlights. No help. Ethan clung to my neck. "I can't breathe." Those 4 words still wake me up sometimes. I wrapped him in blankets, carried him to my old Ford sedan, and drove into the storm. The roads were nearly invisible. Snow hit the windshield so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept talking to Ethan. "Stay awake, sweetheart. I'm here. Keep talking to me." His voice became weaker. "I'm sleepy." "No, baby. Stay with me." The drive to Mercy General normally took 15 minutes. That night, it felt like a lifetime. At one intersection, my car slid across the road. I almost hit a snowbank. I remember crying while driving, not because I was afraid for myself, because I was afraid that my son might die beside me. When I finally reached the emergency entrance, 2 nurses ran outside with a stretcher. One of them recognized me. "Sydney." I couldn't answer. I simply handed Ethan to them. Everything happened quickly after that. Doctors, monitors, oxygen, questions. His oxygen levels were dangerously low. His lungs were severely inflamed. The emergency physician ordered immediate treatment. That was the first time I met Dr. Michael Reynolds. He was a pediatric specialist with gray hair and kind eyes. He examined Ethan for several minutes before turning toward me. "Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes." "We need to move him to intensive care." The world became silent. Intensive care. No parent wants to hear those words. I followed the nurses through long hospital hallways while they pushed Ethan's bed toward the pediatric ICU. He looked so small. The machines surrounding him looked larger than his body. When they closed the ICU doors, I finally broke. I sat in a chair outside the room and cried until I could barely breathe. Dr. Reynolds found me there. He handed me a cup of coffee. "When was the last time you slept?" I couldn't remember. "When was the last time you ate?" I couldn't remember that either. He sat beside me. "Your son is very sick." My heart stopped. "But we're doing everything possible." I nodded. "Will he be okay?" He looked down for several seconds before answering. "I honestly don't know yet." That first night lasted forever. Machines beeped. Nurses walked in and out. Doctors whispered. Every time someone entered Ethan's room, my heart began racing. At 3 in the morning, a nurse brought me a blanket. At 4, another nurse offered food. I refused both. How could I eat while my son fought for air? Morning arrived, but nothing improved. The fever remained high. His breathing became worse. Dr. Reynolds explained that the infection had spread rapidly. The next 24 hours would be critical. I called nobody. There was nobody to call. My parents had both passed away years earlier. Robert was gone. Friends offered help, but none of them could sit beside my son for me. So I stayed, hour after hour, day after day. The hospital chair became my bed. Coffee became my food. Fear became my companion. On the second night, a nurse named Carol approached me. "You need rest." "I can't leave." "He won't know." I looked through the glass toward Ethan. "He'll know." And I truly believed that. Children know. They know who remains. They know who stays. At least I thought they did. Late during the third night, alarms suddenly sounded inside the ICU room. Several nurses rushed inside. Dr. Reynolds appeared seconds later. I stood up immediately. Nobody would let me enter. I watched through the glass as people moved around my son. Machines flashed. Voices rose. Someone called for medication. I pressed my hands against the window. "Please." No one heard me. Or perhaps they simply couldn't answer. 10 minutes felt like 10 years. Finally, Dr. Reynolds walked toward me. His face looked exhausted. I couldn't breathe. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "He's stable." I nearly collapsed. Tears poured down my face. "He scared us." I covered my mouth. Dr. Reynolds continued quietly. "If you had arrived even a little later that night, we might be having a very different conversation." I looked toward Ethan's room. The machines still surrounded him. The tubes remained. But he was alive. That was enough. On the 5th night, I finally entered his room after he regained consciousness. His eyes opened slowly. He looked confused. Then he saw me. "Mom." I took his hand. "I'm here." His voice was weak. "Were you here all night?" I smiled through tears. "Every night." He squeezed my fingers. "Good." Then he fell asleep again. 32 days. That is how long Ethan remained in the hospital. 32 nights. 32 mornings. 32 opportunities to leave. I never left. I slept in chairs. I showered in employee locker rooms. I changed clothes inside hospital bathrooms. Every evening, I sat beside the ICU window and prayed. Dr. Reynolds once said something I never forgot. "Sydney, your son is fighting very hard." I looked at Ethan. "No." He looked confused. "I'm fighting because he's fighting." Years later, Ethan would tell people that nobody stayed awake worrying about him. Nobody sacrificed for him. Nobody carried him. But Dr. Reynolds knew. Nurse Carol knew. The ICU staff knew. And somewhere deep inside that little boy who once asked if I would stay all night, I believe he knew too. He simply forgot. 32 days after Ethan entered the intensive care unit, Dr. Michael Reynolds finally walked toward me with a smile I had not seen before. "He can go home." For several seconds, I simply stared at him. I had spent over a month preparing myself for every possible tragedy. I had imagined funerals, empty bedrooms, and silence so many times that I had forgotten how hope sounded. "Really?" I whispered. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "He still needs treatment and monitoring, but he's strong. Stronger than we expected." I looked through the glass toward Ethan's room. He was sitting upright in bed, holding one of his toy cars. The oxygen tube had been removed earlier that morning. His cheeks finally carried a little color again. At that moment, I wanted to thank God, every nurse, every doctor, and every stranger who had prayed for him. Instead, I simply cried. The hospital bills began arriving 2 weeks later. Some arrived in white envelopes. Others came in large brown packages. Every day, another number appeared. $3,000, $5,000, $12,000. I placed them on my kitchen table and tried to calculate how many years it would take me to repay them. The answer frightened me. I worked overtime whenever possible. I accepted every extra shift: Christmas, weekends, holidays, night shifts, double shifts. My feet constantly hurt. My back ached. Sometimes I slept inside my car before driving home because I was too exhausted to stay awake behind the wheel. Yet every morning, Ethan greeted me with a smile. "Did you save people last night, Mom?" "Yes." "Are you tired?" "A little." He would kiss my cheek, then sleep. Children often believe parents can rest whenever they want. Parents know that life doesn't work that way. Several months after Ethan returned home, my supervisor called me into her office. "Sydney, there's an opportunity." I sat across from her. "The hospital wants you to become assistant nursing manager." I stared at her. The promotion would increase my salary significantly. Better benefits, more stability, a chance to finally breathe financially. "When would it start?" 6 weeks. "What are the hours?" She hesitated. "Longer days, some travel, administrative meetings." I already knew the answer. Ethan still had medical appointments every week. Sometimes the school called because he had difficulty breathing. Sometimes he woke up sick. Sometimes he simply needed his mother. "I can't." She looked disappointed. "You've earned this." I smiled softly. "I know." "Why would you turn it down?" "Because my son needed me. Because promotions don't hold frightened children during the night. Because careers can wait. Childhood cannot." I never told Ethan about the promotion. Children should never feel guilty for being loved. Money remained a constant problem. One evening, I opened my jewelry box. Inside sat my wedding ring. I had kept it after Robert left, not because I loved him, because it represented the family I once thought we would become. The next morning, I sold it. The jeweler offered far less than it was worth. I accepted immediately. The money paid medical bills and bought Ethan's medication for several months. When I returned home, I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes. Not because I missed Robert, but because another piece of my life had disappeared. I realized that motherhood often asks women to give away things nobody ever notices: jewelry, dreams, sleep, careers, youth, time, and sometimes the people we sacrifice everything for never see what vanished. When Ethan was 7, his school organized a parents' career day. He asked me to come. I had worked the previous night and had not slept. Dark circles surrounded my eyes. My uniform was wrinkled. But I arrived anyway. Another mother whispered to someone nearby, "She looks exhausted." I wanted to laugh. Exhausted had become my natural state. During the presentation, Ethan stood beside me. "This is my mom." The children smiled politely. "She works at a hospital." One little boy asked him, "Is she a doctor?" Ethan shook his head. "No, she's just a nurse." Just a nurse. The words weren't cruel. He was only a child. Yet they stayed with me. Because somewhere inside society we teach children to measure importance through titles. Doctor, lawyer, executive, manager. Nobody says, "This woman stayed awake for 32 nights. This woman sold her wedding ring. This woman gave up promotions. This woman refused to leave a hospital chair." That year, I began writing in my blue notebook. At first, I only recorded medical information, temperatures, appointments, medication changes. But gradually, the pages became something else. I wrote my fears, my prayers, my exhaustion, the things I could never tell anyone. One page read, "Ethan slept peacefully tonight." I watched him breathe for an hour because I was afraid to close my eyes. Another, "He asked if his father misses him." I lied again. And another, "If I die before he understands how much he is loved, I hope someone tells him." I never intended Ethan to read these pages. The notebook became my companion. Eventually, there were 2 notebooks, then 3. I placed them inside an old wooden box in my bedroom closet. Alongside them, I kept hospital bracelets, discharge papers, medical records, and photographs from the ICU. I told myself that someday I would show him. Someday when he became old enough. But there never seemed to be a perfect moment. As Ethan grew stronger, life slowly became normal. He joined Little League. He made friends. He rode bicycles. He laughed more. Every victory felt enormous. At one baseball game, he hit his first home run. Parents cheered. Children ran onto the field. I cried quietly from the bleachers. Another mother sat beside me. "You're emotional. You don't understand." She smiled. "He hit a baseball." I looked toward Ethan. No. He breathed. He ran. He lived. That was the miracle. That night, Ethan entered the kitchen carrying his baseball trophy. "Mom?" "Yes." "Are you proud of me?" I laughed softly. "Proud isn't a big enough word." He grinned. "When I'm rich someday, I'm buying you a giant house." I kissed his forehead. "I don't need a giant house." "What do you want?" I answered honestly. "I just want you healthy." He hugged me. "I'll always take care of you too." Children make promises because they believe forever is simple. Adults know better. A few weeks later, Dr. Reynolds called me into his office after Ethan's appointment. "He's improving beautifully." I smiled. "Thank you." He looked at me carefully. "And how are you?" I almost laughed. Nobody had asked me that question in years. "I'm fine." "No, Sydney." His voice softened. "How are you?" For the first time, I admitted the truth. "I'm tired." He nodded. "You've been carrying this alone." "I know." He opened a drawer and handed me something. A photograph. It showed me sleeping in the hospital chair outside Ethan's ICU room. A nurse had taken it years earlier. A blanket covered my shoulders. My hand still rested against the glass window beside Ethan's room. "I thought you should have this." I stared at the picture. I had no memory of sleeping, only waiting. Dr. Reynolds said quietly, "One day, your son needs to see what love looked like." I placed the photograph inside the wooden box, beside the notebooks, beside the hospital bracelets, beside 32 nights that nobody else remembered. At the time, I believed those memories would eventually matter. I believed sacrifice naturally reveals itself. I believed children grow older and finally understand. I had no idea that years later, my own son would stand in a beautiful dining room and speak as though none of those years had ever happened. And when that day came, the wooden box would become the only witness left. Time has a strange way of healing children while quietly exhausting their parents. By the time Ethan turned 16, his hospital visits had become rare. The inhalers remained inside our kitchen cabinet, and his medical records still filled an entire drawer in my bedroom. But life finally resembled something close to normal. He had grown taller than me. His shoulders had widened. The little boy who once slept beside oxygen machines now played varsity baseball and talked endlessly about college. Sometimes I would watch him leave for school and think about the child who had once struggled to walk across a hospital room. Miracles do not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they simply become teenagers. Ethan was handsome, intelligent, and ambitious. His teachers loved him. His coaches praised him. The first time he brought home a college brochure, he placed it on the kitchen table. Ohio State. I smiled. That's impressive. I'm going there someday. And you will. He laughed. You always say that. Because it's true. I had spent years teaching him to believe in himself. Perhaps I forgot to teach him where his strength came from. As graduation approached, Ethan received a scholarship that covered part of his tuition. The remaining expenses would still be difficult, but I had quietly been saving money for years. Small amounts, $20, $50, sometimes less. Every extra shift I worked added a little more to the envelope hidden inside my closet. On the night before he left for college, we sat on the back porch together. The summer air felt warm. Crickets filled the darkness. He looked nervous. What if I fail? You won't. What if I'm not good enough? I looked at him. Ethan, you've been fighting your entire life. He smiled. Because of you. Those words stayed with me for years. The next morning, I drove him to the university. His dorm room was small. His roommate seemed kind. Parents carried boxes through crowded hallways while students talked excitedly about the future. Before I left, Ethan hugged me. I'll call every week. I laughed. You don't have to. I want to. And for a while, he did. He called every Sunday. He told me about classes, friends, exams, girls, professors. I listened to every story. The house felt quieter without him, but his voice still filled my evenings. Then life began moving faster. His grades improved. Internships appeared. Business opportunities arrived. His calls became shorter. I'll call tomorrow, Mom. Busy week. Sorry, I forgot. At first, I understood. Young people build lives. Parents step aside. That is natural. But gradually, something else changed. During his final year of college, Ethan became interested in real estate. He spoke constantly about investments, networking success, and money. I was proud of him. But sometimes, his conversations felt unfamiliar. He no longer talked about people. He talked about opportunities. He no longer asked about my work. He asked about property values. One evening, he visited home for dinner. I made his favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. As we sat together, he looked around the house. This place is getting old. I smiled. So am I. He laughed politely. I'm serious, Mom. You should sell this place eventually. I looked around the kitchen. The wallpaper was faded. The cabinets were old. But this house had witnessed everything. The first steps, the fevers, the recovery, the nightmares, the laughter. I couldn't imagine leaving. I like it here. He shrugged. You deserve something better. At the time, I thought his words came from love. Maybe they did, maybe not. After graduation, Ethan accepted a position with a growing real estate company in Columbus. His salary exceeded anything I had earned in years. I cried when he called me. You did it! No, Mom. We did it. Those words comforted me for a while. His success arrived quickly. Promotions, bonuses, new clothes, luxury apartments, business trips, professional photographs on social media. He looked confident, important, successful. Sometimes I barely recognized the little boy who once slept holding his stuffed bear. Then He introduced me to Claire. Claire Bennett was beautiful, elegant, sophisticated. She worked in marketing and came from a wealthy family. She spoke carefully, dressed perfectly. Everything about her seemed polished. When Ethan brought her home for Thanksgiving, I welcomed her warmly. She complimented my cooking. She thanked me for dinner, but there was a distance in her eyes that I couldn't explain. As the evening ended, she walked through the house. This place has character. People often use the word character when they mean old. I smiled politely. She looked toward the staircase. How long have you lived here? Almost 30 years. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Wow! The following year, Ethan proposed. I was thrilled. I helped pay for part of the wedding. I used money from my retirement savings because I wanted his day to be beautiful. I never told him. Parents often spend money silently. The wedding itself was elegant. Claire's family paid for most of it. Their guests arrived in expensive cars. Their conversations revolved around business vacations and investments. I wore a simple blue dress. Several people assumed I was a distant relative. During the reception, one of Claire's relatives asked me, "And what do you do?" "I'm a nurse." She nodded politely. "Oh." Nothing else. Just, "Oh." I watched Ethan dance with his new wife. He looked happy. That was enough. Or at least I told myself it was. After the wedding, the phone calls became even less frequent. Sometimes weeks passed, then months. When I called, Ethan often sounded distracted. "I'm in a meeting." "We have guests. I'll call later." Sometimes he did. Often he didn't. Claire rarely spoke to me. When she did, her voice remained kind, but distant. At Christmas, they visited for only a few hours. Claire suggested eating at restaurants instead of home. She talked about moving to a larger house, a better neighborhood, more opportunities. One afternoon, I overheard something I was never supposed to hear. Claire and Ethan were standing in the kitchen. They thought I was upstairs. "This house embarrasses you, doesn't it?" Claire asked. He didn't answer immediately. "I just don't fit here anymore." Those words entered my heart quietly. Not fit here. This house had held oxygen tanks, hospital bills, baseball trophies, school projects, birthday cakes. It had survived everything. And now, my son no longer fit inside it. That night after they left, I sat alone in my bedroom. I opened the wooden box. The photographs remained, the hospital bracelets, the notebooks, the picture of me sleeping beside the ICU window. I ran my fingers across the pages. Part of me wanted to show Ethan. Part of me wanted him to understand. But another part of me feared something worse. What if he simply didn't care? Months later, Ethan invited me to dinner at his new home. The house was beautiful. Large windows, modern furniture, perfect landscaping. Claire greeted me politely. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully designed. As we sat together, Ethan talked about investments and future plans. I listened quietly. Then he laughed and said, "You know, Mom, I built all of this myself." Everyone at the table smiled. I smiled too, but something inside me became uneasy because for the first time I realized my son was beginning to believe his own story. A story where he had climbed every mountain alone. A story where nobody carried him. Nobody sacrificed. Nobody stayed awake. And somewhere in that new version of his life, the exhausted nurse who sat beside an ICU window had slowly disappeared. I still believed he would remember. I still believed time would bring him back. I did not know that the woman sitting beside him, Claire, would soon help create a distance between us that neither of us fully understood. And I certainly did not know that one future dinner would leave me standing in front of strangers while my own son erased my entire life with a single sentence. The dinner that changed everything took place on Ethan's 35th birthday. Claire had organized a celebration at their new house in Columbus. The guest list included business partners, neighbors, investors, and several couples from their social circle. 2 weeks before the party, Ethan called me. "We'd love for you to come, Mom." I smiled. "Of course. And if you don't mind, maybe you could arrive early. Claire could use some help." The old version of me immediately answered, "Absolutely." I drove to their house at noon carrying homemade lasagna apple pie and the chocolate cake Ethan had loved since childhood. When Claire opened the door, she looked relieved. "Oh, good you're here." She kissed my cheek quickly. "The caterers are running late." I placed the food inside the kitchen. What can I do? For the next several hours, I chopped vegetables, arranged plates, folded napkins, and prepared desserts. The house was beautiful. White marble counters, glass dining tables, fresh flowers. Everything looked like something from a magazine. Yet somehow, I felt as though I didn't belong there. Claire walked through the kitchen giving instructions. "The wine glasses go here. The appetizers stay cold. Could you refill these?" She wasn't rude, not exactly, but she spoke to me the same way she spoke to the catering staff. By 5 o'clock, guests began arriving. Men in expensive suits, women wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my car. Everyone seemed successful. Everyone seemed comfortable. Ethan stood near the entrance greeting people. He looked handsome, confident. He wore a tailored navy suit and expensive watch. People shook his hand. They praised his success. One man said, "You've built an incredible life." Ethan smiled. "I've worked hard." I stood quietly in the kitchen, arranging desserts. Several guests assumed I worked there. One woman handed me her empty glass. "Could I have some more wine?" She looked embarrassed when Claire explained. "Oh, I'm sorry." "It's okay," I said, and it truly was. I wasn't embarrassed by being mistaken for staff. I had spent my entire life serving people, but something inside me noticed that nobody introduced me. Nobody said, "This is Ethan's mother. This woman raised him alone. This woman saved his life." I simply moved quietly through the room. Around 7 o'clock, everyone gathered near the dining area. Claire tapped a glass. "I'd like to say a few words about my husband." People applauded. She spoke beautifully. She praised Ethan's determination, his ambition, his intelligence, his ability to build success from nothing. The phrase caught my attention. From nothing. Then Ethan stood beside her. He thanked everyone for attending. He spoke about his business, his future plans, his goals. Everyone listened. Then one of his business associates asked, "Who inspired your work ethic?" Ethan laughed. "Honestly, nobody." Several people smiled. He continued, "I pretty much taught myself everything." The room chuckled. He raised his glass. "When you're on your own early in life, you learn to survive." My stomach tightened. "On your own?" A woman beside him asked, "So nobody pushed you?" Ethan smiled. "I learned not to depend on people." Another guest laughed. "Self-made man." Ethan raised his glass again. "Exactly." The room applauded. I stood only a few feet away. For a moment I thought perhaps he would look at me. Perhaps he would smile. Perhaps he would say, "My mother worked herself to exhaustion. My mother raised me. My mother stayed." Instead, he continued, "No one stayed awake worrying about me. I figured things out myself." The words struck me harder than I can explain. No one stayed awake worrying about me. For several seconds, I couldn't hear anything else. The room remained cheerful. People nodded. Someone clapped. But suddenly, I wasn't standing in that dining room anymore. I was sitting in an ICU chair. I was driving through a snowstorm. I was counting breaths. I was selling my wedding ring. I was working double shifts. I was watching machines beside a hospital bed. No one stayed awake 32 nights. 32 nights. My hands began shaking. I set the dessert tray down because I was afraid I might drop it. Claire smiled proudly at him. His friends admired him. And my son, my little boy who once asked me if I would stay all night, stood in front of strangers and erased my entire life. I said nothing. Mothers become experts at silence. After the toast guests returned to their conversations, a woman approached me. "You must be so proud." I forced a smile. "I am." She looked toward Ethan. "He's incredible." "Yes. He really built everything himself." I looked at my son. "No one builds everything alone." She laughed politely, assuming I was making a general observation. I wasn't. I walked into the kitchen. For the first time in years, I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. Claire entered a few minutes later. "Could you help cut the cake?" I stared at her. She seemed completely unaware. Or perhaps she had heard Ethan's words so often that they no longer sounded cruel. As we cut slices, she spoke quietly. "Ethan's worked very hard." "I know. He always says he had to figure everything out himself." I looked at her. "Does he?" She nodded. "He never talks much about his childhood." I wanted to tell her everything. The hospital, the fevers, the chair, the snowstorm. But the words remained inside me, because I realized something terrible. My son had rewritten his own history. And perhaps he truly believed it. As guests prepared dessert, the front door opened again. An older man entered carrying a wrapped gift. His hair had turned gray. His shoulders had become slightly bent with age. The moment I saw him, I stopped breathing. Dr. Michael Reynolds. He looked around the room before his eyes landed on me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled warmly. "Sydney." I stood. "Dr. Reynolds." Ethan approached us. "You know each other?" Dr. Reynolds looked surprised. "Of course." He turned toward Ethan. "You probably don't remember me." Ethan shook his head. "I'm sorry." The doctor smiled. "I suppose that's understandable." I watched his eyes move from Ethan to me. Something changed in his expression. He looked confused, almost concerned. "Were you his pediatrician?" Ethan asked. Dr. Reynolds nodded slowly. "For many years." Claire smiled. "What a small world." The doctor looked directly at me. "Very small." I could see questions forming behind his eyes, questions he didn't ask. Not yet. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Dr. Reynolds found me standing alone on the back patio. The air felt cool. The city lights shimmered in the distance. He stood beside me. "Does he know?" I stared ahead. "No." His voice became quiet. "He doesn't remember." I shook my head. "Apparently not." Dr. Reynolds looked toward the dining room where Ethan laughed with his friends. "I've spent 30 years in medicine, Sydney." I said nothing, and I have never forgotten those nights. Tears filled my eyes. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then he said something that frightened me. "I still have the records." I turned toward him. The hospital records, the ICU notes, the photographs, the truth. For the first time in years, I realized that somewhere outside my wooden box, Someone else remembered. Someone else had witnessed those 32 nights. And standing inside his beautiful home, surrounded by people who believed he had built himself alone, my son had no idea that the man who had saved his life had just walked back into it. I barely slept after Ethan's birthday party. The drive back to Cleveland felt longer than usual. Rain tapped against my windshield, and every traffic light seemed to last forever. For 35 years, I had protected my son from painful truths, and in return, he had forgotten me, perhaps not intentionally. Perhaps memory simply changes when people become successful. Still, his words followed me home. No one stayed awake, worrying about me. When I entered my house, the silence felt heavier than usual. I placed my purse on the kitchen table and walked directly to my bedroom closet. The wooden box sat exactly where it had always been. I opened it. The notebooks, the hospital bracelets, the medical bills, the photographs, the old picture Dr. Reynolds had given me years ago. I sat on my bed holding the photograph. There I was asleep in the hospital chair. One hand rested against the glass. The ICU lights reflected across the window. I looked exhausted, old, broken, and somehow completely at peace. Because my son was alive. My phone rang the following afternoon. I already knew who it was. "Hello? Sydney, Dr. Michael Reynolds." His voice sounded older now, softer than I remembered. "How are you?" I almost laughed. "Which answer would you like?" "The honest one." I sat beside my kitchen window. "I'm tired." There was silence. Then he said quietly, "So am I." He asked if we could meet. A small coffee shop near the hospital. The same hospital where we had spent 32 nights together. I agreed. When I arrived, he was already sitting near the window. His hair had turned almost completely white. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, but his eyes were exactly the same. Kind. Observant. The eyes of a man who had spent his life watching people suffer. He stood when he saw me. "Sydney." "Michael." For several moments, neither of us mentioned the party. We spoke about retirement, the hospital, life, his grandchildren, my work. Eventually, he placed his coffee cup down. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. I looked away. Neither could I. He folded his hands. "Does Ethan truly not remember? He remembers being sick. But not you." I smiled sadly. "I suppose children rarely remember who sat beside them." Michael shook his head. "No." He looked directly at me. "Most of them do." That sentence hurt more than I expected, because somewhere inside me I had spent years wondering whether I had failed. Perhaps I had not reminded Ethan enough. Perhaps I had hidden too much. Perhaps I had protected him so completely that he never realized what had happened. Michael reached into his briefcase. My heart stopped. Inside was a thin hospital folder. Very old. The edges had become yellow. The label read, "Ethan Bennett. Pediatric ICU, January." I stared at it. "You kept it." He nodded. "I kept several cases throughout my career." "Why?" He smiled softly. "Some patients save doctors too." I didn't understand. He continued. "Your son was one of the sickest children we treated that winter." I looked down. "You remember that?" "No." His voice became quieter. "I remember you." My eyes filled with tears. "You never left that hallway." I said nothing. "Do you remember the 4th night?" I shook my head. "There were complications. I felt my chest tighten. You collapsed. What? Michael nodded. You hadn't slept. You hadn't eaten. I stared at him. I truly had no memory. You fainted outside the ICU. Pieces slowly returned. A wheelchair, a nurse, voices, but everything remained blurry. I forgot. He smiled sadly. Mothers usually do. The waitress brought fresh coffee. Neither of us touched it. Michael opened the folder. Inside were notes, charts, medical reports, and photographs. One photograph showed Ethan connected to machines. Another showed me sitting beside his bed. A third showed Nurse Carol covering me with a blanket. I stared at the images. 30 years disappeared. The hospital sounds returned. The fear returned. The exhaustion returned. Michael pointed toward one document. I never showed you this. It was one of his old notes. Under observations, he had written, Mother refuses to leave bedside. Severe exhaustion. Extraordinary devotion. I looked away. I was only being his mother. He shook his head. No. He leaned forward. You were saving his life. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Michael asked, Does he know about his father? My stomach tightened. No, nothing. Only that Robert left. Michael sat quietly. I always wondered why you protected him. I stared out the window. Because Ethan deserved one good parent. You were already one good parent. I smiled sadly. I wanted him to believe he had two. Michael sighed. I remember Robert. That surprised me. He came to the hospital once. I looked up immediately. What? He stayed less than 20 minutes. My hands began shaking. He never told Ethan. No. He told me he couldn't watch his son suffer. I felt tears forming. He said the treatment costs would destroy everyone. The room became silent. For years, I had carried that memory alone. I had never spoken about it. Not to Ethan, not to friends, not to anyone. Michael continued quietly. You asked me not to document that conversation. I nodded. I remember. You wanted Ethan to love his father. I wanted him to be happy. Michael leaned back. And now? I looked down at the folder. I don't know. When we finished our coffee, he carefully returned the papers to his briefcase. These belong to you. I hesitated. No. He looked surprised. Why? Because if I keep them, they'll stay hidden. He was silent. And if you keep them, I met his eyes. Someone else remembers. Before leaving, he said something I would think about for weeks. Sydney, memory is strange. I waited. Children forget pain because they need to survive. And parents remember because they need to love. That evening, I returned home and sat in my living room. The house felt smaller, older, but somehow warmer. I walked to the closet again, opened the wooden box. This time, I took out one notebook. The first page was dated 30 years earlier. My handwriting looked younger, more hopeful. The first sentence read, If Ethan survives, I will spend the rest of my life being grateful. I began reading. Page after page, fear, prayer, exhaustion, hope. And suddenly, I realized something. I had spent decades protecting my son from difficult truths. I protected his father. I protected his childhood. I protected his image of our family. But nobody had protected me. The following week, Ethan called. "Mom?" His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "We should have lunch sometime." I hesitated. "Maybe." There was a pause. "Dr. Reynolds seemed to know you pretty well." My heart stopped. "Yes. He said you went through a lot when I was sick." I swallowed. "You were very ill." "I barely remember it." "I know." He laughed softly. "I guess I was lucky." I closed my eyes. Lucky. Such a small word. A word that ignored hospital chairs, night shifts, fear, sacrifice. But I simply answered, yes. After we hung up, I sat alone in the quiet house. Outside, snow had begun falling, very softly. For the first time in years, I wondered whether the truth eventually finds people on its own. Because Dr. Michael Reynolds still had the records. Nurse Carol was still alive. The wooden box still existed. And somewhere deep inside my son, a little boy once asked me if I would stay all night. Perhaps that child had not disappeared completely. Perhaps he was simply waiting to remember. The conversation that finally broke us happened 3 weeks after I met Dr. Michael Reynolds. Spring had begun to arrive in Ohio. The snow had disappeared. The trees outside my kitchen window were turning green again. For most people, spring means renewal. For me, it became the season my son decided he no longer needed me. Ethan called on a Sunday afternoon. His voice sounded unusually enthusiastic. "Mom, Claire, and I want to come by." "Of course." "We need to discuss something." Those words made me uneasy. People rarely announce difficult conversations in advance. I spent the morning cleaning the house. I baked blueberry muffins. I made coffee. Part of me hoped this visit meant something had changed after the birthday party. Perhaps Ethan had thought about what he said. Perhaps Dr. Reynolds had spoken to him. Perhaps my son remembered. When they arrived, Claire carried a leather folder. Ethan looked serious. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Ethan had once done homework. The same table where I had sorted medical bills. The same table where I had watched him recover from fevers. Claire opened the folder. "We've been talking about your future." My future. The words felt strange. Ethan leaned forward. "Mom, this house is worth more than you realize." I looked around the kitchen. The old cabinets, the faded wallpaper, the scratches on the floor. "This old place?" "Yes." He pulled several papers from the folder. "We spoke to a realtor." My stomach tightened. "You what?" Claire answered gently. "We were only gathering information." Ethan smiled. "You could sell the house." I remained quiet. "The market is excellent right now." He continued talking. Numbers, investments, property values, development opportunities. I heard every word, but none of them reached my heart. Finally, I asked, "And where would I live?" Claire immediately answered, "There are wonderful retirement communities." Retirement communities? The words echoed inside my head. This house was not simply property. It was Ethan's first steps. His first fever. His first bicycle. His first baseball trophy. Every room carried memories. The living room still had the mark on the wall from when he threw a baseball indoors. The hallway still contained pencil lines measuring his height. The upstairs bedroom had once held oxygen equipment, and they wanted me to sell it. Ethan reached for my hand. Mom, listen. I pulled my hand away. This house could help us make a significant investment. Us. Not me. Us. Claire opened another page. We've found a commercial property opportunity. I finally understood. This was not about my future. This was about theirs. Ethan spoke carefully. If you sell, now everyone benefits. I looked directly at him. Everyone. He sighed. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Something inside me became very still. For 35 years, I had given him everything. My sleep, my youth, my career, my health. And now my son was asking for the last thing I still possessed. My home. I stood and walked toward the living room. They followed. I stopped beside the staircase. Do you remember this spot? Ethan looked confused. What? You fell here when you were 6. He frowned. No. You needed stitches. Nothing. I walked into the kitchen. That chair. He looked. You used to sleep there when your breathing was bad. He remained silent. I looked toward the hallway. The bathroom floor. You had a fever there. Nothing. Not one memory. Claire crossed her arms. Sydney, I understand the house is emotional. Emotional. That word. As if 35 years could be reduced to sentiment. I looked at her. No, Claire. I turned toward Ethan. This house saved your life. He frowned. What does that mean? I almost told him. The hospital, the nights, the wooden box, everything. But years of silence stopped me. Instead, I simply said, I can't sell. The room became quiet. Ethan looked disappointed. Why? Because this house is mine. He stood. And someday it will sit empty. Then let it. Claire exchanged a glance with him. He took a deep breath. Mom, sometimes I feel like you're holding on to the past. I answered quietly. Because the past matters. Not this much. I looked directly into his eyes. To me, it does. He began pacing. For the first time in years, I saw frustration. Real frustration. Everything becomes emotional with you. I felt something break. What does that mean? You never move forward. I stared at him. He continued. You stay stuck. Claire touched his arm. Ethan. But he was already speaking. You make everything about sacrifice. My heart stopped. What? You always act like you've suffered more than everyone else. I could barely breathe. I never said that. You don't have to. His voice grew louder. I've spent my whole life feeling guilty. Guilty? Yes. He pointed toward the house. The old house. The stories. The way you look at me. I felt tears forming. I look at you with love. No. His voice cracked. You look at me like I owe you. The room became completely silent. For 35 years, I had expected nothing. Not money, not success, not gratitude, only love. And somehow, my son believed I wanted payment. I sat down because my legs no longer felt steady. Claire spoke quietly. Nobody is saying that. But Ethan continued. Maybe I need space. The words hung in the air. Space, distance, separation. I looked at my son. The little boy from the ICU had disappeared completely. Is that what you want? He looked away. I think so. Because I won't sell the house. It's bigger than the house. What is bigger? He finally said the words. You make me feel responsible for your happiness. I wanted to scream. My happiness had never depended on him. My happiness had been his survival, his breathing, his life. But somehow all those years had transformed into guilt inside him. I stood slowly. If that's how you feel, then maybe you should have space. Claire looked uncomfortable. Ethan looked shocked. Mom. No. I walked toward the hallway. You should go. Nobody moved. I think we're all upset, Claire said. I looked at my son. I won't sell this house. Silence. I won't ask for your money. More silence. And I won't apologize for remembering your childhood. Ethan grabbed his jacket. His face looked hard. I just want my own life. I nodded. You already have it. He walked toward the door. Then he stopped. Without turning around, he said something I will never forget. You've always made me feel like I owe you for being sick. The front door closed. The sound echoed through the house. I stood alone. For a long time, I could not move. Hours later, after darkness filled the rooms, I walked upstairs. I opened my closet. The wooden box waited. This time, I took everything out. The journals, the photographs, the hospital bracelets, the medical records, the picture of me sleeping outside the ICU. I placed them inside a smaller box. Then I wrote Ethan's name on the lid. Ethan. No explanation, no letter, no anger, only his name. The following morning, I drove to Columbus. Neither Ethan nor Claire were home. I used the spare key he had once given me. I placed the box inside a closet near the front entrance. Somewhere he would eventually find it, or ignore it. I left the key on the kitchen counter. And before leaving, I wrote a short note. Take care of your life. I will take care of mine. Love, Mom. As I drove home, I realized something painful. For 35 years, I had stayed, through sickness, through fear, through loneliness. But perhaps love sometimes requires leaving. And for the first time in my entire life, I began thinking about a future that did not include waiting for my son to remember me. The morning after I left the wooden box inside Ethan's house, I woke up before sunrise. For 35 years, every important decision in my life had involved my son. What school should he attend? What doctor should he see? What medicine could I afford? What job should I keep? How many hours could I work? Everything had always begun with Ethan. That morning, for the first time, I asked myself a different question. What does Sydney Bennett want? The answer frightened me because I honestly did not know. The house felt unusually quiet. No phone calls, no messages, no apology. Part of me expected Ethan to call after finding the box. Perhaps he would ask questions. Perhaps he would become angry. Perhaps he would finally understand. Days passed. Nothing happened. I went to work, returned home, cooked dinner for one, sat beside the television, read books, watered the flowers outside the porch. And every evening, I found myself staring at the telephone. Silence became another room inside the house. One Saturday afternoon, Linda Parker knocked on my front door. Linda had been my closest friend at the hospital for nearly 20 years. She had retired 2 years earlier and moved to a small town near Lake Michigan. She carried 2 coffees. "You look terrible." I laughed. "Thank you." "No, seriously." We sat on the porch. I told her everything. The birthday party, the argument, the house, the wooden box. She listened quietly. When I finished, she asked one question. "What would happen if you stopped waiting?" I looked at her. For what? For him. The words settled heavily between us. Mothers wait. We wait for first steps, first words, phone calls, visits, apologies, grandchildren, recognition. Perhaps we spend our entire lives waiting. Linda continued. "You've spent 35 years taking care of someone else." I said nothing. "When was the last time you took care of yourself?" I honestly couldn't answer. She smiled gently. "You should come see me." "Where?" "Harbor Springs." I had never visited. "It's beautiful," she said. "Lake Michigan, small shops, quiet streets." I laughed. "You make it sound like another country." It is. A month later, I took 3 vacation days. The drive north lasted nearly 6 hours. As I approached the lake, the world seemed to become quieter. The water stretched endlessly. The air smelled different. People walked slowly. Nobody appeared rushed. Nobody seemed impressed by success. I rented a small room at a bed and breakfast. That evening, Linda took me to the shoreline. The sun was setting. Orange light covered the water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "You can breathe here." And surprisingly, I could. During the following days, I visited bookstores, coffee shops, small bakeries, art galleries. I spoke to strangers. I slept through the night. I realized something that frightened me. I felt peaceful. Not because I had stopped loving Ethan, but because I had stopped waiting for him. Before returning home, I walked through a small neighborhood near the lake. A modest cottage stood beside a row of trees. A sign in the yard read, "For rent." The woman showing the property was kind. The cottage had 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a porch facing the water. Nothing expensive, nothing impressive. Yet when I walked inside, I experienced something I had not felt in years. Possibility. I returned to Cleveland carrying photographs. For several nights, I looked at them. The lake, the cottage, the trees, the porch. Then, one evening after another silent day, I made a decision. I applied for early retirement. The hospital administration was shocked. "You still have years left." "I know." "What will you do?" I smiled. "I don't know yet." Dr. Michael Reynolds called when he heard the news. "Retirement. Apparently." He laughed softly. "You've earned it." "Have I?" "Sydney, you earned it 30 years ago." 3 weeks later, I packed boxes, clothes, books, kitchen dishes, photographs, and finally the wooden closet where the memories had lived. But the wooden box was gone. It now belonged to Ethan. Or perhaps it belonged to the truth. I sold very little. Most things stayed. The house would remain for now. Perhaps someday Ethan would want it. Perhaps not. I no longer knew. On my final evening in Cleveland, I walked through every room. The kitchen, the hallway, the staircase, Ethan's bedroom. I touched the marks on the wall showing his height. Age 6, age 10, age 14, age 18. I cried quietly, not because I regretted anything, because every room contained love. The next morning, I drove north, toward Harbor Springs, toward the lake, toward a life I had never expected to live. Linda helped me move into the cottage. The porch overlooked the water. Birds filled the morning air. For the first time in decades, nobody needed me. The realization felt both painful and freeing. Several days later, my phone rang. Ethan. I stared at the screen. Eventually, I answered. Mom? His voice sounded distracted. Where are you, Michigan? Silence. Michigan. I moved. Another silence. You moved? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I looked out toward the lake. The water moved gently. I didn't think you wanted to be responsible for my happiness. He said nothing. The words had reached him. Finally, he spoke. When are you coming back? I live here now. Mom. His voice softened. This seems sudden. I almost laughed. 35 years. Nothing about this was sudden. I needed a change. Are you angry? I considered the question carefully. No. Then why? I answered honestly. Because I wanted to know who Sydney Bennett is. He didn't understand. Perhaps I wouldn't have understood either. Before hanging up, he asked, Are you okay? For the first time in many years, I answered truthfully. Yes. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The stars reflected on the lake. The air felt cool. For the first time in my life, I was not somebody's nurse, not somebody's mother, not somebody's caretaker. I was simply a woman sitting beside the water. Yet somewhere hundreds of miles away, a wooden box sat inside my son's house. And I still did not know whether he had opened it. 3 months after I moved to Harbor Springs, Ethan still had not opened the wooden box. At least that was what I believed. He called occasionally. Short conversations, questions about the weather, questions about the cottage, questions about whether I needed money. Never questions about the box. Never questions about the hospital. Never questions about the past. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt invisible. Summer arrived along Lake Michigan. I began volunteering at a small community center that helped single mothers. Some needed childcare. Some needed help finding jobs. Some simply needed another woman to listen. For the first time in years, people knew me as Sydney. Not Ethan's mother, not the nurse, just Sydney. One afternoon, a young mother named Melissa sat across from me crying. Her son had asthma. She was working 2 jobs. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. As she spoke, I saw myself 30 years earlier. I don't think I'm doing enough, she whispered. I reached across the table. If you're still standing, you're doing enough. She cried harder. I wanted to tell her that children often survive because their mothers refuse to collapse. But I also knew something else. Sometimes mothers collapse quietly years later. That evening, I returned home and found 2 missed calls from Ethan. The 3rd call came just after 9. Mom. His voice sounded different. What happened? Silence. Then I lost a client. I sat down. A big one. The biggest. His real estate company had spent months negotiating a commercial development project. According to Ethan, everything had depended on it. The investors had withdrawn. The deal had failed. Several employees would lose their jobs. I don't know what to do. The words surprised me. For years, Ethan had spoken like a man who needed nobody. Now his voice sounded young, almost frightened. What does your company say? They blame me. I listened. For over an hour. I didn't offer solutions. I simply listened. At the end of the call, he became quiet. Thanks, Mom. You don't need to thank me. I know. The following weeks became difficult for him. Several projects stalled. The housing market weakened. Investors became cautious. Ethan had built his reputation on success. Now failure arrived publicly. Claire struggled with the changes. At first, she remained supportive, but money changes relationships. Stress changes conversations. Fear changes people. One Saturday morning, Ethan called again. Claire and I are fighting. I remained silent. Everything feels different. What happened? He laughed bitterly. Apparently, I'm not the man she married. The words hurt me because I remembered another man saying something similar years earlier. Robert. He had also struggled when life became difficult. He had also walked away from problems he could not control. For several days, I thought about calling Ethan more often. Then I stopped myself. He was a grown man, and I had finally learned that mothers cannot rescue adult sons the way they rescue children. One evening, Linda came to visit. We sat on my porch watching the lake. You've heard from him? Yes. Is he struggling? I nodded. She looked toward the water. Sometimes life teaches lessons parents can't. The phone rang again 2 weeks later. This time, it was Claire. Her voice trembled. Sydney. Claire. I don't know who else to call. My heart immediately raced. What happened? Ethan collapsed. The room became silent. Collapsed. One word, 30 years, disappeared. I was back in the emergency room. Back beside hospital machines. Back inside fear. Where is he? Riverside Medical Center. What happened? They think it's exhaustion. I was already grabbing my purse. My hands shook. The same shaking. The same fear. The same helplessness. The drive to Columbus felt endless. Rain covered the highway. My heart refused to slow down. Every mile brought memories. Ethan at 4. Ethan unable to breathe. Ethan calling for me. When I arrived at the hospital, Claire sat alone in the waiting room. She looked exhausted, older, more vulnerable. She stood immediately. I'm sorry. For what? For everything. I embraced her, because hospitals remove pride, because fear makes honesty easier. A doctor eventually appeared. Mrs. Bennett. I stood. He experienced severe exhaustion and stress-related complications. Is he going to be okay? The doctor nodded. He needs rest. Rest. The word almost made me laugh. For 35 years, I had prayed to hear those words. The doctor continued. His blood pressure is dangerously high. Claire lowered her head. He hasn't been sleeping. I closed my eyes, not sleeping. The irony felt unbearable. For years I had stayed awake worrying about him. Now he stayed awake alone. The doctor allowed us to enter his room. Ethan looked pale, older. The confidence I had seen at birthday parties had disappeared. The successful businessman had vanished. My son remained. His eyes opened slowly. He saw Claire, then me. Mom? I walked closer. I'm here. Exactly the same words. Exactly the same answer. 30 years later. He looked confused. You came. Of course. Tears filled his eyes. The machines around his bed were much smaller than those from his childhood, but somehow they sounded the same. beeping, monitoring, waiting. Claire eventually went home to shower and rest. I remained. Hours passed. The nurses changed shifts, the lights dimmed, and for the first time in decades, I sat beside my son's hospital bed. Around midnight, Ethan woke again. The room was dark. He looked toward me. "You're still here." I smiled. "Yes." He looked confused. "You don't have to stay." I adjusted the blanket. "I know." He studied my face. "You look tired." I almost laughed. "I've looked tired for 30 years. He managed a weak smile. After several minutes, he asked quietly, "Did I really worry you that much when I was little?" The question caught me by surprise. I looked at him. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. "Yes." "Was I very sick?" I swallowed. "Sometimes." He nodded. "I don't remember much." "I know." Silence filled the room. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Finally, he whispered, "I've been having dreams." "What kind?" "A hospital." My heart stopped. "There are windows." I said nothing. "A chair." I could barely breathe. "And someone sitting there." He turned toward me. "I can't see who it is." I looked away because tears had already formed. Memory. Perhaps it had begun. Perhaps not. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan fell asleep again. I remained in the chair, watching, listening, waiting. Outside the hospital window, rain continued falling, and for the first time in many years, my son spent the night inside a hospital while I stayed awake beside him. Neither of us realized that the wooden box still waited inside his house. And very soon, the truth inside it would change both our lives forever. Ethan remained in the hospital for 4 days. The doctors insisted that stress exhaustion and severe anxiety had pushed his body beyond its limits. His blood pressure slowly improved, but his energy did not return. For the first time in his adult life, success had stopped protecting him. The expensive suit was gone. The confident businessman had disappeared. He wore a hospital gown. His hair looked uncombed. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and every time I entered his room, I saw traces of the little boy who once fought for every breath. Claire visited every morning. She brought coffee. She answered business calls. She spoke with doctors. But something between them had changed. The arguments had become quiet. The distance had become visible. One afternoon, while Ethan slept, Claire sat beside me in the hospital cafeteria. She looked exhausted. "I don't know how you did it." I looked at her. "Did what?" She lowered her eyes. "When he was sick." I stirred my coffee. "He was my son." "I've only been here 3 days." Her voice broke. "And I'm already falling apart." I said nothing. She continued. "He talks about you when he's sleeping." My heart stopped. "What does he say?" "He keeps asking someone not to leave." For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. Because 30 years earlier, Ethan had asked exactly the same thing. "Please stay. Please don't leave." Claire reached across the table. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For never asking." I looked at her. "About his childhood." She nodded. "He never talked about it." Neither did I. "Why?" I smiled sadly. "Because I wanted him to move forward." She whispered, "Maybe he moved too far." That evening, a nurse entered Ethan's room carrying medication. She looked to be around 65. gray hair, gentle eyes. The moment she saw me, she stopped. "Sydney?" I stood. For several seconds, we simply stared at one another. Then she smiled. "Oh my goodness." It was Carol Jensen, Nurse Carol. The same nurse who had covered me with a blanket during those endless nights in the ICU. Time had aged both of us, but memory had not. She embraced me. "I heard the name Bennett and I wondered." She turned toward Ethan. He looked confused. "You know my mom," Carol laughed softly. "Young man, I knew your mother before you could even walk." Ethan smiled politely. "I guess Mom knows everyone in hospitals." Carol looked at him. No. She looked through him, toward the child she once cared for. "You don't remember me." He shook his head. "I'm sorry." She nodded. "That's understandable." The room became quiet. Carol checked his blood pressure, adjusted his medication. Then she looked at me again. "Can I steal you for a moment?" We stepped into the hallway. She touched my arm. "He doesn't know, does he?" I shook my head. She sighed. "I wondered after seeing him." I looked down. "He remembers very little." Carol became silent. Then she said, "I still remember the chair." The chair. I swallowed. The blue chair outside the ICU. My eyes filled with tears. She smiled gently. "You slept there for weeks." "I wasn't sleeping." "You fainted twice." I looked at her. "I only remember once." She shook her head. The second time it happened in the hallway. Memory failed mothers, but nurses remembered. Carol looked through the hospital window. "I've worked here 40 years. I listened. "I've seen parents leave." My heart tightened. "I've seen marriages collapse." She looked at me. "I've seen mothers disappear after a few days." Her voice softened. "But you never left." Tears rolled down my cheeks. She squeezed my hand. "We talked about you for years." I laughed through tears. "Why?" "Because you reminded us why we became nurses." When I returned to Ethan's room, he looked curious. "What was that about?" I sat beside his bed. "Old memories." He looked toward the hallway. "She seems to know me." "She does." He frowned. "Did she take care of me?" "Yes." He became quiet. "Was I really that sick?" I looked at him. This question again. Perhaps the memories were moving. Perhaps they were approaching. "You almost died." The words hung in the room. He stared at me. "What?" I had never said them aloud. Not once. Not in 30 years. "You were 4 years old." His face became pale. "I almost died." I nodded. He looked away. "I thought it was asthma." "It was much more than that." Silence. The monitor beeped softly. He spoke again. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my hands. "Because you survived." "And I wanted you to live." He seemed confused. "I did live." "No." My voice became softer. "I wanted you to stop being a patient." He stared at me. "I wanted you to be a child." He said nothing. That night, Carol returned during her shift. She stood beside Ethan's bed. "You gave us a scare back then." He looked uncomfortable. "I don't remember." She smiled. "Your mother remembers enough for both of you." After she left, Ethan asked quietly, "Did you stay with me?" The question felt almost unreal. I looked at him. "Yes." "For how long?" I hesitated. The number sounded impossible. 32 nights. His eyes widened. "What?" I nodded. "I slept outside the ICU." He stared at me. "Every night." "Every night." His voice became very small. "Why?" I almost laughed. Because mothers do not ask why. Because love never asks why. Because breathing children are worth every sacrifice. Instead, I simply answered, "Because you were afraid." He turned toward the window. "I don't remember." "I know." The room remained quiet for several minutes. Then he whispered, "I've been dreaming again." "What kind of dreams?" "The same chair." I felt my chest tighten. "The same window." He closed his eyes. "And someone crying." Tears filled my eyes immediately. Because I remembered. The fourth night, the alarms, the fear, the prayer. He opened his eyes again. "Was that you?" For several seconds I could not speak. Finally, I nodded. "Yes." His face changed. Not completely. Not yet. But something had begun. The wall he had built around his past had cracked. Late the next morning, Claire went home to collect clothes and paperwork. I remained beside Ethan. A volunteer brought magazines. Television played quietly. The world outside continued normally. Then Ethan suddenly asked, "Mom?" "Yes." "Did Dad stay?" The question froze me. 30 years. 30 years of silence. 30 years of protection. I looked at my son. He looked tired, vulnerable, honest. And for the first time in my life, I did not know how to answer. Because somewhere inside his house, the wooden box still waited. And inside that box rested the truth about his father. The truth about me. The truth about 32 nights. And I realized that very soon, my son would finally open a door I had kept closed his entire life. I did not answer Ethan's question. "Did Dad stay?" The words remained suspended between us like a door neither of us was ready to open. The doctor discharged Ethan the following afternoon. His blood pressure had improved. His tests looked better. Physically, he would recover. Emotionally, I wasn't sure. Claire drove him home. I returned to Harbor Springs. Before leaving the hospital, Ethan hugged me. The embrace felt unfamiliar. Not because it lacked love, because it carried uncertainty. "Will you come back this weekend?" he asked. "I don't know." His eyes lowered. "Okay." For the first time in years, my son looked afraid of losing me. The drive north felt quiet. Lake Michigan welcomed me with gray skies and cold wind. Linda was waiting on my porch with soup. "How is he?" "He'll recover." "And you?" I sat beside the window. "I think something is changing." She nodded. "Good." "I didn't say it was good." She smiled. "Sometimes pain is the only thing strong enough to wake people up." 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice sounded strange. "Sydney?" "Yes." "I think you should come." My heart immediately tightened. "What happened?" "It's Ethan." "Is he back in the hospital?" "No." She hesitated. "He found the box." The world became silent. 30 years. 30 years inside one wooden box. 30 years hidden beneath silence. I drove to Columbus the following morning. The house looked different, quieter. The expensive cars were gone. The curtains remained closed. When Claire opened the door, her eyes were red. "He hasn't slept." "Where is he?" She pointed upstairs. I climbed the staircase slowly. Every step felt heavy. The bedroom door was open. Ethan sat on the floor. The wooden box surrounded him. Its contents covered the carpet: photographs, hospital records, medical bills, notebooks, old insurance statements, discharge papers, and in his hands rested the photograph. The one showing me asleep outside the ICU. He looked up. His eyes were swollen. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Is this real?" I looked at the photograph. "Yes." He swallowed. "You slept there?" "Yes." 32 nights. I nodded. His hands shook. "Why didn't you tell me?" I sat across from him. "Because I wanted you to live your life." He looked around the room. Every piece of paper represented a sacrifice. Every receipt, every note, every page. He picked up one hospital bill. The amount had been circled. His voice trembled. "You paid all this eventually." "How?" I smiled. "Slowly." He opened one of the blue notebooks. My handwriting filled every page. He read aloud. January 14th. Ethan slept for 2 hours tonight. I counted every breath because I was afraid he would stop breathing if I closed my eyes. His voice broke. He turned another page. January 19th. I sold my ring today. Ethan smiled when his fever dropped. I would sell everything if he keeps breathing. He stopped reading. Tears rolled down his face. I didn't know. I know. He opened another notebook. February 2nd. Dr. Reynolds says we may lose him. I am trying to be brave because Ethan looks at my face every morning. His shoulders began shaking. I don't remember any of this. I moved closer. You were 4. He looked at me. But you remembered. I nodded. Every day. For several minutes, he simply sat there. The successful businessman. The confident son. The man who believed he had built himself. Now surrounded by proof that he had survived because someone else refused to sleep. He picked up another item. The hospital bracelet. Tiny. Faded. His name. Age 4. He stared at it. I was this small? Yes. And you stayed? Yes. His voice became quiet. Nobody told me. I almost answered. I wanted to say, I told you every day by showing up. I told you every night by staying. I told you every sacrifice by making it. But instead I said, I thought you knew. The room became silent. Then he found the envelope. The final envelope. The one I had never opened with him. His name appeared on the front. Ethan. He looked at me. What is this? I took a deep breath. The truth. 30 years waiting inside paper. You can read it. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter. Not from me. From Dr. Michael Reynolds, written years earlier. He began reading. Mrs. Bennett requested that these details remain private unless Ethan wishes to know the truth as an adult. Your father visited the hospital only once. He expressed concern about the financial cost of treatment and stated that continuing aggressive care would destroy the family financially. Your mother refused. She insisted that every possible treatment be attempted. She remained beside your bed every day afterward. Your mother saved your life! The room became completely silent. Ethan stopped breathing for several seconds. No. His voice barely existed. He wanted to stop. I looked down. Yes. His eyes filled with disbelief. He knew I might die. I nodded. He couldn't handle it. Ethan stood abruptly. No. He walked toward the window. No. His voice became louder. You told me he loved me. He did. He wanted me to die. He wanted the suffering to stop. He turned toward me. And you lied. The words hurt, but they were true. Yes. Why? My voice trembled. Because I wanted you to have one parent you could love. His tears returned. But you protected him. Yes. Why? I looked directly into his eyes. Because somebody needed to protect you. He sat down again. His entire understanding of his childhood had collapsed. His father had not been a tragic victim. His father had left. His mother had not been simply a nurse. She had fought everyone, even his father. He opened another notebook. Near the end, he found a sentence. If Ethan survives, I hope he never feels guilty for living. He read it twice. Then he looked at me. You never wanted me to owe you. No, he cried openly. But I treated you like that. I said nothing, because he already knew. He looked around the room again. The documents, the bills, the photographs, the years. Then he picked up the photograph of me sleeping outside the ICU. He stared at it for a long time. Finally, he whispered, I dreamed about this. I felt tears return. The chair. He nodded. The window. I could barely speak. And someone crying. He looked at me. It was you. I nodded. He covered his face with his hands. For years, he had believed nobody stayed awake, nobody worried, nobody sacrificed. Now the evidence surrounded him. Paper cannot lie. Photographs cannot lie. Hospital records cannot lie. And for the first time since he was 4 years old, my son truly saw me. Not as his mother, not as an obligation, not as a guilty memory, but as the woman who stayed awake during the hardest nights of his entire life. And somewhere inside that room, another truth still waited. Because Ethan had finally learned what his father did. But he still did not understand what his mother gave up afterward. And the weight of that realization had only just begun. The room felt smaller after Ethan finished reading Dr. Reynolds' letter. The afternoon sunlight entered through the bedroom windows, falling across the scattered papers on the floor. Hospital bills, medical reports, my notebooks, photographs. 30 years of silence spread between us. Ethan still held the letter. His hands trembled. He wanted to stop treatment. I lowered my eyes. Yes. He thought I wasn't worth saving. No. My voice sounded tired. He thought the cost was too high. Ethan stood and began pacing across the room. I don't understand. Neither did I. Not even after 30 years. When did he say it? The 4th night. He stopped. The night the alarms went off. I looked at him. Somehow he remembered that. Only fragments, only shadows. But something inside him had begun to return. I nodded. Your condition became worse. He swallowed. And Dad left. Yes, just like that. He said he couldn't watch you suffer. Ethan laughed bitterly. No. He looked directly at me. He couldn't watch himself suffer. I said nothing, because he was right. For years, I had protected Robert because I wanted Ethan to grow up believing he had once been loved by both parents. But now I realized something. Children eventually discover the truth, sometimes through words, sometimes through silence, sometimes through old letters hidden inside boxes. Ethan sat down again. Did he ever come back? No. He never called. No. He never asked about me. I hesitated. The truth felt cruel. No. He covered his face. The room became quiet. For several minutes, only the sound of traffic outside filled the silence. Finally, he looked at me again. And you still protected him? Yes. Why, I thought about all the years. Birthday parties, school events, Father's Day projects, questions, lies, small lies, large lies, every one of them spoken because I believed they would protect him. I didn't want you growing up feeling unwanted. His eyes filled with tears. But I grew up not knowing who stayed. The sentence broke something inside me. Because he was right. I had protected one absence while hiding one presence. I had hidden myself. Ethan picked up another notebook. Near the middle, several pages had become stained. Tears, coffee, exhaustion. He read silently. Then his voice began shaking. Mom! I looked up. He turned the notebook toward me. The page contained a sentence I had written years earlier. If Ethan survives, I hope he never spends one day feeling responsible for my sacrifices. His voice cracked. You wrote this? Yes. But I always thought. He couldn't finish. I helped him. You thought I wanted something back? He nodded. I did. I took a deep breath. Ethan, I never wanted repayment. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid. The answer appeared before I could stop it. I was afraid. He looked surprised. Of what? That you would feel guilty. He stared at me. I wanted you to have a normal life. He looked around the room. Instead, I forgot your life. The words hurt because they were true. Downstairs, we heard Claire moving quietly through the kitchen. Neither of us moved. Ethan spoke again. Did Dr. Reynolds know all this? Yes. Nurse Carol? Yes. And everyone else? Many people? His eyes widened. So, everyone knew except me? I nodded. He looked down at the photograph, the one showing me sleeping in the chair. I don't recognize this woman. I smiled sadly. Neither do I sometimes. He stared at the picture. You look exhausted. I was. You look scared. I was. His voice became very soft. And you stayed. Yes. He looked up. Why? The question again, 35 years later. The same answer. Because you were my son. Tears rolled down his face. I don't deserve you. I shook my head. No. What? You don't earn your mother. The room became silent. Because love does not operate like business. It does not keep records. It does not send invoices. It does not demand payment. It simply stays. After a while, Ethan asked, "Did you ever hate him?" I knew immediately who he meant. Robert. No. Why not? Because hatred takes energy. He looked confused. I used all my energy keeping you alive. He laughed through tears. That evening, Ethan asked to see the remaining papers. Together, we opened every envelope, every receipt, every medical record. The amount of debt shocked him. Thousands of dollars, payments stretching across years. He found records showing second jobs, overtime shifts, loans. Then he discovered something I had forgotten, a hospital employment letter. He read it, assistant nursing manager position. He looked up. What is this? I recognized it immediately. The promotion, the one I had declined. I forgot about that. You turned it down. Yes. Why? I smiled. You had appointments. His face fell. Mom, you needed me. He read further. The salary was nearly double what I earned. The benefits were better. The opportunities greater. You gave this up. Yes. He looked stunned. You never told me. I didn't think it mattered. It matters. I shook my head. No. His voice became stronger. It matters because I spent years believing you never had dreams. I looked at him. Perhaps that was true, or perhaps I had simply placed my dreams somewhere else. Later that night, Claire entered quietly. She sat beside Ethan. He showed her the photograph. She covered her mouth, then the notebooks, the bills, the letter. She began crying. I didn't know. I smiled gently. Neither did he. Claire looked at her husband. You said you did everything alone. Ethan lowered his head. I believed it. She reached for his hand. I think you had to. He looked confused. She continued. If you remembered how much someone loved you, maybe failing would feel impossible. None of us answered, because perhaps she was right. Perhaps Ethan had rewritten his childhood because success required him to believe he owed nobody, but illness had removed that illusion. Around midnight, I prepared to leave. Ethan stood. You're going? I have a 6-hour drive. He looked frightened. When will I see you again? I paused. The answer mattered. For years, I would have come immediately, dropped everything, canceled everything. But now things were different. I don't know. His eyes filled again. Please. I walked toward him. I need time too. He nodded. Because healing belongs to both people, not only the child, not only the parent. Before I reached the door, he said quietly, I spent my whole life loving a father who left. I turned and ignored the mother who stayed. Neither of us moved. Finally, I walked back and embraced him. For several seconds, he held me exactly the way he had as a frightened 4-year-old. Tightly, desperately. As if he were afraid I might disappear. And for the first time in 35 years, my son understood something that had taken me an entire lifetime to learn. A parent's greatest sacrifice is not what they lose. It is remaining silent about what they lost. I returned to Harbor Springs carrying emotions I could not describe. For 35 years, I had prayed that Ethan would remember. Now that he finally did, neither of us knew what to do with the truth. The lake greeted me with cold wind and gray skies. Summer had begun to fade, and the mornings carried the first signs of autumn. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the water. For the first time in months, my phone remained silent. Not because Ethan had forgotten me, because he was thinking, and perhaps grieving his father, grieving his childhood, grieving the mother he never truly saw. 3 days later, Dr. Michael Reynolds called. Ethan contacted me. I looked toward the lake. He did. He asked to meet. My heart tightened. What happened? Michael was quiet. He wanted to hear everything. I closed my eyes. Everything. The thing I had protected him from his entire life. He deserves the truth, Michael said. I know. 2 weeks later, Ethan drove north. He arrived alone. Claire had stayed behind. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize him. He had lost weight. The confidence that once surrounded him had softened. He looked older, more human. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he embraced me. Not politely, not briefly. He held me the way frightened children hold their mothers. I missed you. I touched his shoulder. Come inside. The cottage felt warm. The lake shimmered beyond the windows. He walked slowly through the rooms. So, this is where you live? Yes. It's peaceful. I smiled. It is? We ate dinner quietly. Soup, bread, tea, simple things. Eventually he asked, Are you happy here? I looked outside. Yes. The answer surprised him. You really don't want to come back? I thought carefully. No. He lowered his eyes. I think I thought you'd always be waiting. The honesty hurt. But it was true. For years, he believed I would always remain exactly where he left me. In the old house, beside the telephone, waiting. I had stopped waiting, and perhaps that frightened him. That evening, we walked beside the lake. The wind felt cold. The waves rolled gently against the shore. Ethan spoke quietly. I met Dr. Reynolds. I looked at him. He told me about the storm. I said nothing. He said you drove through a blizzard. Yes. He said I stopped breathing. I nodded. He said the doctors weren't sure I would survive. The tears returned to his eyes. I didn't know. I know. He stopped walking. Why did nobody tell me? I looked toward the water. Because I wanted you to feel normal. But I wasn't normal. No. I smiled sadly. You were alive. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, Did you ever regret me? The question shocked me. I stopped walking. What? He looked down. The money. The career. The house. The years. His voice broke. Did you ever wish you had chosen yourself? I walked closer. Ethan. He looked up. I chose myself. He looked confused. I don't understand. I chose the person I loved. Tears rolled down his face. I wasted so many years. No. I said horrible things. Yes. I treated you like a burden. I nodded gently. You did. He covered his eyes. I'm so sorry. The apology arrived quietly. Not dramatic, not perfect, but real. For several minutes, we simply stood beside the water. Eventually, he spoke again. Claire left. I looked at him. What? He nodded. 3 days ago. My heart sank. Why? He laughed softly. She said she doesn't know who I am anymore. I remained silent. He continued, I don't know who I am either. The businessman, the successful son, the self-made man. All of it had collapsed. He looked toward the lake. I built my entire life on a story that wasn't true. I touched his arm. No. He looked at me. You survived. He frowned. You worked hard. He said nothing. You built your career. Still silence. But you didn't build yourself alone. His tears returned. That night after dinner, we sat on the porch. The stars reflected across the lake. For the first time in years, Ethan spoke about his childhood, his asthma, the fevers, the nightmares, the fear. Fragments slowly returned. I remember a window. I smiled. I know. I remember hearing someone cry. I looked down. That was me. He nodded. I think I always knew. I looked at him. What do you mean? He stared toward the water. I think I spent years trying not to know. The sentence stayed with me, because perhaps memory is not always lost. Sometimes it is buried, protected, hidden. The next morning, Ethan found me sitting outside with coffee. He carried something in his hands. The photograph. The one from the hospital. He sat beside me. I brought this. I looked at the picture. You should keep it. He shook his head. No. He handed it to me. For 30 years, you carried this alone. His voice became quiet. You don't have to anymore. I held the photograph. The exhausted woman in the chair. The mother beside the glass. The woman I had almost forgotten myself. Ethan looked at me. I want to know everything. I smiled sadly. Everything takes time. He nodded. I have time. For the next 2 days, we talked. About Robert, about the hospital, about the years afterward, about the promotion, about the house, about his anger, about my silence. Nothing healed immediately. Pain rarely does. But understanding began. On his final evening, Ethan stood beside the lake. The sun was setting. Orange light covered the water. He looked older than his years, and younger, both at the same time. Mom. Yes. He turned toward me. I finally remember something. My heart stopped. What? He smiled through tears. You told me you would stay. The wind moved softly across the lake. I could barely breathe. I remember asking if you would leave. Tears filled my eyes. And you said no. He walked toward me. And you didn't. For 35 years, I had waited to hear those words. Not thank you, not I'm sorry, not I love you, only this. He remembered, the little boy who feared the darkness, the little boy who couldn't breathe, the little boy who needed his mother. He had finally found his way back. And as we stood together beside the lake, I realized that healing had never been about making my son feel guilty. It was about helping him remember that he had never been alone. Winter returned to Harbor Springs slowly. The trees lost their leaves. The lake became gray. The wind carried the first snow of the season. And for the first time in many years, Ethan began calling not because he needed advice, money, or reassurance. He called because he wanted to know me. Sometimes he asked about my childhood, sometimes about my work at the hospital. Sometimes he simply wanted to hear my voice. Healing did not happen quickly. It never does. There were awkward conversations, long silences, moments when guilt overwhelmed him, moments when pain overwhelmed me. But we kept talking, and that was new. One morning in early December, I woke up feeling unusually tired. At first, I blamed the weather. Then the dizziness began. Linda insisted on taking me to the clinic. The doctor smiled kindly. Nothing serious. But I needed several days of rest. High blood pressure, exhaustion, stress. The irony was not lost on me. After decades of caring for everyone else, my body had finally asked me to stop. I did not tell Ethan. Old habits are difficult to break. Mothers hide their pain. 3 days later, someone knocked on my door. I opened it. Ethan stood there. Snow covered his coat. His eyes looked worried. "Why didn't you tell me?" I smiled. "Who told you?" "Linda." He stepped inside. For a moment, we simply looked at one another. Then he said something I never expected. "My turn." I frowned. "What?" "My turn to stay." The words took my breath away. 35 years earlier, I had sat beside his hospital bed. Now my son carried groceries into my kitchen. He cooked dinner. He made tea. He reminded me to take my medicine. He checked my blood pressure. He even argued with me when I tried to wash dishes. "You need to rest." I laughed. "I've heard that before." "So have I." At night, I would wake up and find the living room light still on. Ethan sat reading, sometimes working, sometimes simply waiting. One evening, I walked into the room. "Why aren't you sleeping?" He looked up. "I wanted to make sure you're okay." I felt tears immediately because I recognized the answer. The same answer I had lived for decades. The same fear. The same love. "You don't have to stay awake." He smiled sadly. "I know." For several days, neither of us mentioned it, but both of us understood. One night, snow fell heavily outside. The cottage became quiet. The fireplace glowed softly. Ethan sat beside me. "Mom." "Yes. I think I finally understand." I looked at him. "What?" "The nights." I remained silent. He stared into the fire. "When I was in the hospital, I couldn't sleep." I listened. "I kept waking up to make sure you were there." His voice became smaller. "I think I stopped being afraid because I knew you wouldn't leave." Tears filled my eyes. "I didn't." He nodded. "I know." He looked at me. And I left. I reached for his hand. "You came back." He lowered his eyes. "Too late." "No." He looked surprised. No parent wants their child to arrive at a funeral with understanding. His eyes filled again. "You came while I could still hear you." Christmas arrived quietly. Claire called. She and Ethan had officially separated. There was no anger, no scandal, simply two people who had become strangers. Ethan moved into a smaller apartment. He reduced his work. He sold some investments. For the first time since college, he began building a life that actually belonged to him, not his image, not his success, his life. In January, Dr. Michael Reynolds called. The hospital planned a fundraising event for the pediatric ICU. Would we attend? At first, I refused. The memories still hurt, but Ethan said, "Please." So we went. The hospital looked different. New walls, new equipment, new nurses, but the old hallway remained. The old waiting area. The place where 32 nights had changed my life. Ethan stopped beside the window. The same window. The same view. He looked at me. "You sat here." I nodded. He touched the wall. "I don't know how to thank you." I smiled. "You already did." The event gathered doctors, nurses, former patients, and donors. Dr. Michael Reynolds spoke first. Nurse Carol sat in the front row. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan walked toward the podium. I looked surprised. He had not told me. He stood quietly. His hands shook. For a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy from the hospital. Then he spoke. "When people asked me about success, I used to tell them I built my life alone." The room became silent. I was wrong. He looked toward me. "My mother worked night shifts as a nurse." My eyes filled. "She sold her wedding ring." Dr. Reynolds lowered his head. "She gave up promotions." Nurse Carol cried. "She slept outside an ICU for 32 nights because her 4-year-old son might die." His voice broke. "And I forgot." The entire room remained silent. He looked directly at me. "I spent years thanking people who left." Tears rolled down my face, and ignoring the woman who stayed. He stepped away from the podium, walked across the room, and knelt beside my chair, exactly as he had promised himself. "I'm sorry." I touched his face. "I know." "No." His voice trembled. "I'm sorry for every year." People around us cried openly. Dr. Reynolds wiped his eyes. Carol held his hand. "For 35 years, my sacrifices had existed only inside notebooks and photographs. Now they existed inside my son's voice." Later that evening, the hospital administrator showed us something. The old blue chair. The one from outside the ICU. The hospital had kept several pieces of furniture in storage. Ethan looked at it, then at me. "You sat there." I nodded. He touched the armrest. For several seconds, he could not speak. Eventually, he whispered, "Thank you for staying." The following spring, Ethan visited Harbor Springs again. Not as a guilty son, not as a broken man, simply as my son. We walked beside the same lake where he had remembered, the same lake where healing began. "Mom?" "Yes." "If I have children someday, I hope I love them the way you loved me." I smiled. "You will." "How do you know?" Because now he understood. Because now he remembered. Because now he knew that love is not measured by money, success, or sacrifice. It is measured by who stays. And when the hardest nights of his life finally returned, my son discovered what had always been true. He was never alone. He had simply forgotten the woman who stayed awake beside him. And at last, he remembered. Life has a way of teaching us what gratitude truly means. Many parents spend their entire lives making sacrifices that nobody sees. They work extra hours. They hide their fears. They postpone dreams. They stay awake while their children sleep peacefully. Often, they never speak about those sacrifices because love does not keep score. Sydney spent 35 years protecting her son from pain. She protected him from his father's choices, from his own childhood fears, and even from the truth about what she endured. In doing so, she disappeared from her own story. Ethan's greatest mistake was not forgetting the hospital. His greatest mistake was believing he had built himself alone. No one succeeds entirely by themselves. Somewhere behind every strong person stands someone who stayed when leaving would have been easier. This story reminds us that gratitude should not wait for illness, loss, or regret. Call your parents, ask questions, listen to their stories, Learn what they sacrificed before time takes away the opportunity. And if you are a parent who feels unseen, please remember this. Love is never wasted. Even when it is forgotten, it leaves traces. Sometimes people remember too late. Sometimes they remember just in time. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized a sacrifice too late? Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one, please like, subscribe, and join us for the next journey.